enormous pleasure to welcome you all to the 9th Annual Forum of the Scaling Community of Practice. For those of you who are new to the Community of Practice, I'll just say a word or two about it. We're now more than 5,000 strong. We're in 127 countries, 1,300 organizations, and perhaps as unified in one way and as diverse in another as you can imagine a community being. Unified in the sense that we bring to this, I think, a common commitment to trying to see development and climate outcomes really achieve sustainable results at scale. That means solutions need to match the scale of the problem. Very diverse in the sense that we are from funders, from implementers, from some of you are academics and scholars, a number of you are from host country governments. About 70% of us come from the global south. And this group has grown meteorically over the last few years, I think testament to both the concern and the enthusiasm people have for trying to match solutions with problems. The commotion in our terrain over the last several years, particularly over the last year and a half, I think has only added to people's anxiety, but also their intensity about trying to do something about these problems. And we in the Community of Practice are no exception. So think of this genuinely as a community with all the complexity and diversity that a community has, and consider yourselves, even if this is your first time calling in, consider yourselves cordially invited to be part of that community. I'll say just a word or two more about this year's annual forum and then about today's session. So the annual forum for its first years was a very intimate in-person gathering. Started at 40, grew to about 200. And then with COVID, like so many others, we went virtual. At first, I really lamented that, but now I really see the upside. Last year, we had something greater than 1,000 people participate from, I don't know, maybe 100 different countries. And it really added a quality to the conversation that I think would have been impossible in any other way. So welcome wherever you're calling from and whoever you are. The second thing I'll say is that this community of practice has gone through 3 very distinct stages, or I would say it's gone through 2 and is entering a third. For the first 5 or 6 years, we were exclusively and quite determinedly a peer learning group. Everyone gave, everyone got. There was no external objective other than helping each other as much as we possibly could. I would like to believe that that spirit continues, but we've added on to that. And as we've added on, we've added working groups, we've added newsletters, we've added publications. We're now up to 9 working groups and I don't know, some hundreds of publications. But the second real phase I would call addition to the peer learning was knowledge development. And during that phase, our focus was trying to identify where there were still important gaps in our collective knowledge and doing our best to try to fill those gaps. A little bit of modesty, I think we've done quite a good job at filling some of the most important of those gaps. There are many more to go. And finally, this third phase that I feel we're entering now, which is particularly in light of all the disquietude in the development and climate space now. There's been a decision by the executive committee of the Community of Practice to try to focus ourselves as much as we can in trying to inform the practice, not just of ourselves, but of the larger world. So you could say our ambitions are growing and they're growing somewhat exponentially right now to try to see what we can do to make a positive difference in the larger world around us. And you'll hear that in this year's annual forum as in none before. So today's session is going to focus on 3 years of research we've been doing on the behavior of funders. My friend and colleague Johannes will in just a few minutes introduce that in substance, but he will also try to give you a sense of what some of the findings were from that work. We're then in the second session tomorrow, I'll be leading a conversation about what we're going to call a scaling campaign, which is not just focused on funders, but more importantly on host country governments, on implementers, and all of us who are trying in one way or another to be part of the solution to these problems. What is it we now know that we have to do and what will it take to make that happen? The next 8 sessions, you'll be hearing from each of our working groups, talking about how the scaling issue and the scaling campaign relates to their particular area of interest, whether it be a sector like education, health, nutrition, agriculture, or whether it be a problem like fragile states. And then finally, at the end, on Friday of next week, we'll try to bring this all together into a conversation of where do we all go together from here. So whether you know it or not, you are now part of a community, one more community, an important one, this community of practice on scaling development outcomes. And today's conversation is going to be a chance to look at particularly the role of funders in trying to influence that practice. And for that, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend, co-convener, and colleague in all these things, Johannes Lynn.
Thank you, Larry, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you with us today. I'm very grateful to all of the panelists that will join us later in this conversation, and to our moderator who will keep us all on the straight and narrow for 90 minutes today. It's my job to introduce the 3-year initiative on mainstreaming, scaling, and funder organizations. I was supposed to do that together with our co-author, Richard Cole. Unfortunately, he lost his voice, so he wasn't able to make his part of the presentation, but he is online. And if you have any comments on what we talk about today, particularly on this initiative that I will summarize, please do make comments in the chat, and he will actually try to respond as we go along. So feel free to comment, to raise questions in the chat as we go along, and Richard will try and respond and clarify. So I will say a few words first about motivation, method, and scope of this exercise that we carried out for the last 3 years. I will then summarize briefly and in a very high-level way the findings and lessons, and I will end with a few words about next steps that we envisage in follow-up to this particular initiative. So let me start with motivation. You might ask, so why did you focus on funders organization, the international funders in particular, when we know, of course, that scaling has to happen on the ground, and it's the implementers, the innovators, the implementers that need to actually pursue the scaling? Well, we feel and we felt that funders are actually important entry points of potential catalysts. They are influential on the ground, especially in the smaller and low-income countries, but also in middle-income countries and larger countries. They do can exert influence. Now, they have a special responsibility to do no harm, I would argue, but often in practice we found they don't actually help the scaling process, may even hinder it in practice. So we felt it was important for us to look at funders, and we also thought, since we can build on actually, for all 3 of us, the co-authors, Richard, Larry, myself, on experience we've had in engaging with funders over the last 15, 20 years on a one-off basis, including, by the way, Homi Karas, who is one of our panelists today, and Richard Cole and I 20 years ago worked with IFAD in helping IFAD mainstream scaling in its activities. We felt this was actually, we had a platform to build on and experience to build on, but we also felt it was important to go beyond our one-off interventions and support for individual organizations to actually focus on the broader sort of ecosystem of funders and figure out how we can help the ecosystem, the funder community, to actually focus more effectively on scaling. So we thought with this work, we could perhaps more effectively move the needle than we've had on an individual one-off basis. Now, in terms of method, what we chose was what we call an action research method, which means that we partnered with individual funder organizations to help them mainstream as best as we could, and they could, scaling in their own operations, each funder organization, but also to gather evidence in the process that what works and what doesn't work in mainstreaming scaling for the broader funder community at large. We used a case study approach, a very collaborative process, sort of an inside-out process by working with the staff. The staff actually of these organizations, in a number of cases, prepared the case studies with our engagement and support. In some cases, we led the case studies. In other cases, there were actually external experts that joined and also provided a lot of inputs into the case studies. We focused on what good scaling practices are needed to support scaling on the ground, what good scaling practices by funders, and how these good scaling practices can and must be mainstreamed into the operational practice of the fund organizations. In order to do that across the various funders we worked with, we had a common set of questions, but they were adapted in each case to the specific funder as needed. Now, let me end this introduction with brief comment on the scope. So we were quite opportunistic in the way we selected or interacted with funders, depended very much on whether they were interested in working with us. And in many cases, there were organizations where we did already know some of the counterparts we ended up working with. We deliberately chose a broad-gauged approach across the funder community, and with the listing of the funders that we worked with. So you'll see that we had 3 multilateral development banks, 4 bilateral official funders, 6 vertical funds, 6 innovation and research funders, 3 INGOs, and 8 foundations. Let me just flag that among the innovation research funders, we had GCC, Grand Challenges Canada, and we have Carly Silva today to join us on the panel. And among the foundations, we had Fundación Corona from Colombia, and we're very happy to have Natalia Borrero joining us today on the panel. So those were the organizations, broad gauged, as I said. In total, 28 case studies and funder organizations. Not in any way, one must say, a representative sample, but we think by having this broad overview, we can at least begin to get a good impression of what is happening and where the challenges lie, but also where the opportunities. What we did was not a formal evaluation of each case, but a learning experience and a broad diagnostic with the intention to help the funder organization, as I already mentioned, to improve its own mainstreaming process, but also to learn lessons for the community at large. Now, in addition to the case studies, just to flag, we also carried out a number of cross-cutting studies that helped very much inform us also. So we had cross-cutting studies on the perspective of recipients, very important. We looked at scaling localization, scaling and country platforms. Country platforms very much in the news these days, especially in the climate area after COP30. We developed a mainstreaming tracker tool for funders to allow them to track their mainstreaming process. We looked at evaluation methodologies and practices of official funders, and did summary reviews of education funders, agri-food security, and forthcoming of foundations. Finally, we worked with OECD DAC in its development of its scaling guidelines, and I'm very happy that Ben Kumpf serves as a moderator. He was our counterpart in OECD DAC and responsible for developing the scaling guidelines, which I would recommend to all of you. We also engaged throughout the process in consultations. We produced an interim synthesis report about in 2024, end of 2024. Based on that, we informed the annual forum of our preliminary findings. We had events in Washington, Nairobi, Paris, the Financing for Development 4 conference in Spain, and an event in Abidjan. And we had webinars where many of the case studies could be presented. Now we have the final synthesis report and a policy brief that you can find on our website. And I'm now turning, based on what we report in these 2 documents, I can briefly summarize what our major findings and lessons and recommendations are. You will find links to these 2 reports in the chats if you haven't already seen them in the notification that we sent out in connection with this particular event. As we go into looking at what are the findings, lessons, and recommendations, let me start very briefly with a preview of key findings. And maybe the most interesting one actually to start with is that funders, as you look at this 6 stages of scaling process from ideation, research and development and so on, to sustainable impact at scale and sustaining impact at scale, we find that actually funders are active across all these stages. So in principle, that's actually good news, because we can in principle support, the funder community can support countries and actors on the ground throughout the scaling process. The problem is that we found is that actually there are significant gaps, that there's no systematic handoff from left to right, from actors that are principally operating on the left to those operating on the right. So the connectivity across funded community is extremely poor. And as a result, many initiatives that start on the left sort of languish and don't actually succeed ultimately. So that is, in our view, a key finding, and you'll see that we feel that needs to be addressed as we come to the recommendations and lessons. Among the other findings, just to flag up front, is many funders have made progress in mainstreaming scaling, but it's uneven across funders, and in most cases, there's still progress to be made. Importantly, we find that larger funders, especially large official funders, often work at what they consider scale, but scaling is largely transactional. In other words, it's a short-term project model that does not actually translate into longer-term, or what we would call transformational scaling. Smaller funders are somewhat in contrast. Innovation funders, foundations, and yes, also vertical funders have made more progress, but often lack the resources to actually go from the stages at the left of the scaling as a scaling progression to the right. Key gaps that we find, therefore, are that the partnership and handoff between small and large funders is not working right. We're lacking dedicated funding for scaling in the organization, many organizations. Effective localization is still the exception rather than the rule. And the internal incentives, culture, and resource for staff are often missing to support scaling on the ground. Finally, we find that the monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning processes of the organizations don't yet adequately address the scaling dimension. So this is a brief preview. I'm now going to dig into somewhat more detail. And first of all, I will focus on the question, so what does actually good scaling practice represent, which funders ought to be supporting? And here we kind of stumbled on what we believe is an important distinction between what we call transactional versus transformational scaling. Transactional scaling, in our view, is what's predominant right now in many organizations. They measure scale in terms of people and places reached within a particular pilot or a project. And almost any incremental impact is seen as, improving scale and scaling. The projects often have a very short-term, 3 to 5 year max time horizon. There's limited attention to longer-term issues, funding, implementation, sustainability, and scalability. And success is defined as timely board approval and disbursements and achieving project-defined outcomes. Very little thought given to what happens after the project ends. There is, in particular, larger funders, of course, do support systems change, but that tends to be limited to the project timeframe and is usually limited to supporting project goals and not thinking, again, beyond what happens after a project ends. And how does that differ from transformational scaling, which we believe is critical ultimately for lasting impact at scale? Well, transformational scaling targets long-term sustainable impact, 10 to 15 years, and this progress is measured relative to the scale of the problem, not just relative to baseline. Transformation scaling considers long-term scaling pathways to scale, which generally require a phased approach. In the early stages of support, one focuses on creating preconditions for later scaling, including whether or not the innovations or interventions are scalable, what systems change and capacity building are needed to support scaling. And finally, throughout for transformation scaling, there's a focus on financial and implementation sustainability beyond the end of the particular phase or investment and project that's being made. So digging a bit more deeply into then what are good transformational scaling practices, we identify that what needs to be done is to incorporate scalability and sustainability from the beginning with a long-term horizon, to integrate aspects of system change, to make explicit the trade-offs between reach and scale, impact and sustainability, and equity inclusion. This is related to the fact that it's not necessarily maximum scale that is desirable, but actually an optimal scale that allows for these very important trade-offs. A transformational scaling practice needs to double down on localization, needs to invest in partnerships with other funders for effective handoff, needs to support scaling and build support for scaling into the monitoring evaluation practices. And finally, we find it's important to strengthen and focus more on the catalytic role of intermediary organizations that can support scaling. So that, in essence, are sort of the good scaling practices that we think funders ought to support. And now let's turn to the next question, which is what actually needs to be done in order to enable the mainstreaming of these practices in funder organizations. So we find a number of factors that are very important. The most important probably is that there has to be strong, vocal, and sustained leadership from the top in actually making the scaling mainstreaming process happen. But that's not enough. Leaders also and the institutions have to integrate scaling into the missions, the values, the goals, and have to have common and shared definitions for scaling in the organization. And of course, the definition of scaling should focus on transformational, not just transactional scale. Leaders and the organizations have to ensure that the financial and operational instruments and policies and procedures are such that they support scaling. They need to provide dedicated staff and budget resources and tools so that actually the frontline teams can effectively deliver on the scaling promise, scaling support promise. They need to integrate scaling into the key performance indicators of the organization and into the human resource policies and broadly into the organizational culture. And finally, since this process of mainstreaming in our experience extends often over more than 2 or 3 years, even maybe 5, even 6 years, they need to evaluate and adapt the mainstreaming process throughout. The bottom line here, if you look across these various aspects, enablers of mainstreaming, from my perspective, our perspective is that we need to create internal incentives and buy-in for middle management and staff. All too often, middle management staff see the addition of a mainstreaming and a scaling agenda as another unfunded mandate on top of too many already unfunded mandates that they have. So they really need to have not only the general direction, but they also need the active incentives and resources to actually make it happen. Let's move on then to the next topic, which is that we, in our report, ended up comparing how different funder types experienced the mainstreaming process and progressed in mainstreaming process across sort of the multiple dimensions that I just mentioned, including leadership, organizational vision, monitoring evaluation, and so on. And you see here on this graph the results of an exercise that we did by having AI trained on our case studies and ending up measuring with metrics along these various dimensions, comparing the performance across a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is the least effective mainstreaming and 5 the most effective mainstreaming effort that could be achieved. And so you see that there's kind of a clustering of organizations. It involves the multilateral vertical funds, the innovation funders, and the foundations around between 3 and 4, sometimes closer to 5, with the innovation funders a bit closer to 3, and the MDBs and bilaterals closer to 2, sometimes 3, in the center of the graph. You can also see that the strongest area is on average is leadership and organizational vision. Monitoring evaluation, it tends to be the weakest, and also internal resources tend to be quite weak in terms of the mainstreaming dimensions and enablers. But let's take maybe in getting close to the end of my presentation, take a closer look at smaller funders and the larger official funders to sort of compare how they have pursued mainstreaming so far. So in our experience, the smaller funders, innovation funders, foundations, and vertical funds have generally had been given a strong mandate and have a relatively strong culture and incentives for transformational scaling, but their resources are limited in terms of their ability to actually support the whole scaling pathway. They are best in terms of the use of scalability criteria. They have moved into from the left side of innovation focus to a transition to scale stage, and it also employ non-financial measures to support scaling through capacity building, and also their monitoring evaluation tends to focus a bit more on scaling than is the case for others. They also have adopted an intermediary role, especially brokering the next stage financing, convening advocacy where they can, but often they don't find that the response on the other side is all that strong. They're also able to better absorb risk and adopt a portfolio approach and invest in de-risking. The larger funders, especially large official funders, the large bilaterals and multilateral banks, in principle, of course, have the resources to support transformational impact at scale, but as we already mentioned a number of times, there is a gap between rhetoric of scale as a goal and operational practice. Moreover, they often use the one-off project model and short-term transactional approaches. They do invest in system change, but it tends to be one-off, incomplete, and not linked to the scaling pathways. They do have, and they could use, some of them at least, long-term programmatic approaches, but in practice they use them rarely. And primary emphasis is put on accountability, which leads to risk aversion and deters ambitious scaling. So that completes the lessons. And we can turn to what's to be done. Very briefly, we think funders need to focus on scaling to help close the SDG and climate gaps, and not just more funding and bigger projects, which has been until recently very much the focus. Now, of course, under the crisis of financing, we end up with somewhat more focus, and we're in some ways happy to see that greater focus on scaling and effectiveness. We do need sustained leadership for institutional change in the funder organizations. We need long-term sustainable impact at large scale that's proportionate to the problem. And we need program design aligned with systemic constraints and support for systemic change where possible. Then finally, we need funders need to focus on large funders need to focus on transformational change and scale in their support for investment in systems reform, create effective scaling partnerships between small innovation funders and larger actors for handoffs. And I think a lot of responsibility here falls on the larger funders. And we need, in general, integration of scaling more effectively into monitoring evaluation. This ends the summary of lessons and recommendations. And now just a few words about next steps. We have, of course, plans for dissemination of this work with publications, webinars, and presentations. We also stand ready if there's demand for additional case studies and to support mainstreaming by individual funders that would like to have support with assessment, strategy, and implementation. Larry mentioned earlier on the Scaling Campaign 26-2030, which will have a number of initiatives that we're starting to plan and support. In specifically initiatives that support funders, we could and are already engaging in planning for across-the-board assessments of scaling by mainstream scaling by funder organizations, the health and agriculture and food and climate funders. We would be very interested in looking at scaling via country platforms. We think public development banks have an important role in scaling, and we'd be pleased to work with them in integrating scaling into their approaches on the ground. We think more needs to be done on integrating scaling into monitoring evaluation methods and practices. And finally, as many of you are probably aware, there are now a number of global forums and initiatives to rethink development cooperation, and we would be very happy to cooperate with them. throughout, what is needed is we need funders, we need partners to work with us and support this process. And we're looking forward to hearing from many of you if you're interested in working with us on this next stage. Finally, I want to thank all of you who have listened patiently to this 25-minute presentation, much more than I usually like to talk. But I also need to thank, very, very importantly, I mustn't forget, all the funder partners that worked with us on this project, because without them, this could not have been done. And we were so impressed by their willingness to participate. I also want to thank especially the Agence Française de Développement in Paris, who supported us financially with general financial support for this initiative, and especially our good friend, Eric Benoit, who in AFD and Agence Française has been a wonderful partner throughout this process, and we look forward to continuing to work with AFD going ahead. Thank you, and over to you, Larry, again.
Well, that was a yeoman's job, Johannes, of trying to summarize 3 years in 25 minutes. I've had the luxury of watching the chat as it went by. And in addition to some general comments, people have asked for specifics and examples, and for example, how organizations have or haven't created incentives, what they have done that would reflect the kind of direction you've been talking about in terms of meal strategies, how internal systems have or haven't conformed. And I would commend to people's attention, first and foremost, the case studies themselves, which in each and every case go into the specifics of what individual organizations have done. We tried as much of that as we could in the synthesis report and in the policy brief. If, as you read those things, you have comments or questions or your own experience to share, we hope you'll do that, because we see this very much as inevitably a work in progress. We're trying our best to summarize what I think was a very rich experience from the 28 very specific cases. I can't think of a better panel to pick up the conversation than the one we've got. I say that not rhetorically, I honestly believe it. If there were a dream team, this is it. So here comes the panel, and I won't stand in the way with long introductions. I just want to say a word about each one. Ben Kumpf is going to be moderating this panel. Ben is the head of OECD's Innovation Development Facility. He's been a leading voice on this issue in a number of different incarnations at GIZ, at FCDO, at UNDP, and now at OECD. More recently, he's also taken on a mandate for AI. I can't think of anyone better to lead this conversation. The four people he has to talk with each bring a quite distinct perspective on this. Natalia Borrero was and is the lead for planning and learning at Fundación Corona, one of the case studies. And if you were going to pick one to read to get kind of an attitude shift on what foundations can do, I would commend that one in particular to your attention. It's quite remarkable what a small foundation did with a different change of heart. Carly Silver, a leading voice on innovation, the CEO of Grand Challenges Canada, very involved in that case study, and in IDIA, the International Development Innovation Alliance. Jeff Braddock, co-founder, former managing director of Bridgespan, former lots of other things, and current advisor to countless NGOs and foundations, as well as a past board chair of Independent Sector. Homi Karas, a leading voice in reform of official development assistant, currently a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings, a major voice in a whole series of reform efforts, including the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, and a former chief economist for East Asia and the Pacific at the World Bank. Now, if anyone could put together a better panel than that, I want to see it. I'm personally gratified and almost flabbergasted that we have that panel talking with us now on this subject, and I'll hand over to Ben to take it from here.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Johannes, and big thanks to the whole community on scaling development outcomes. Good morning from snowy New York. My name is Ben, as Larry said. It's my pleasure to ask Carly to join me here. Hi, Carly.
Oh, Ben, how are you?
Doing well, thanks. It's amazing to have you here. And before I'm going to go into my first question, I really just want to say that in my perception, your organization, Grand Challenges Canada, together with the other Grand Challenges, have done a really exceptional job in driving strategic innovation and really advancing the field. But also you as an individual I've seen you really as an inspirational change maker in that whole sector, and the work you've been really advancing in the context of the International Development Innovation Alliance, of other partners, as Larry mentioned, I think is really putting scaling ambitions into practice and has set a portfolio of what I deem like really ambitious and strategic initiatives. So something to follow for our dear colleagues who are online. And with that, Carly, you have been driving not only meaningful work in Grand Trans Canada, but also you essentially said, I want to learn more about our institutional arrangements. Let me engage in this study, right? And my first question is, what have you learned, and were there some insights that a little bit surprised you, right? They were not only a confirmation, yes, you're on the right track, but hold on a second, that might have been a thing that I didn't think of, or here's something that we maybe can change. And thinking of our audience, that's probably made up of a combination of some funders and probably many more colleagues who receive funding from the large funders. What were some insights that could be relevant for them?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And very, very pleased to be here with this conversation today, one that is very important. And I think that idea of being set up and incentivized to do this well, I was reflecting as Johannes was talking about some of the success indicators and remembering, I grew up through Grand Challenges Canada as the organization has grown over the last 15 years. And I remember one of my performance objectives one year was to solve early child development scaling, which clearly was not going to happen myself alone. But that's kind of the ambition that is encoded in much of how our organization is set up. For those who don't know, we're an innovation platform and we are almost 16 years old. And so this mainstreaming scale case study process came at a really great time for us, thinking through what is our next 5 years going to look like? What have we learned over 15 years? Our incentive, our goal is to save and improve lives through innovation. And so it's built into how we operate that we have to get to that end goal of scale in order to fulfill our mission. But how to do that is complicated. And as was reflected, we don't sit on the billions of dollars that are needed in order to scale. So thinking really smartly about what is it that we can do at early stages and with smaller amounts of money and our resources and connections that can actually set innovations on a pathway towards scale has been a continuous learning. So an opportunity to kind of reflect ourselves, but then also kind of within the context of this whole reflection is always something we jump at. I think one of the biggest reflections is that we've been very comfortable to take responsibility, accountability for that process of transitioning to scale innovations. The ability for us to say, we're okay to take innovations through phased funding, using patient and patient capital and different forms of capital and supports in order to get innovations from a point where they've shown there's a proof of concept to a point where they've been de-risked and other funders and scale institutions that operate at scale can take them on. We didn't take accountability for that, though. And I think that's one of the things we've been really reflecting on is, well, I see that beautiful, the arrows that show the whole lifespan and the ability for, we have a set of organizations that are responsible across and act across that lifespan. There's no real incentives in the system that pull innovations forward or that incentivize the demand for innovations to be a real force for scale. If you in a very crude and not saying we want to replicate all of this, but in a venture capital approach, an intermediary would have an approach or have an incentive to find those who are interested and model for having them hand off to the next kind of fund in order to get their exit, and so they can keep doing more things. We don't have that in our systems, and for us to be able to think through what's our incentive to really orchestrate that handoff, to orchestrate the adoption, to orchestrate the demand is something in this next 5 years we are going to, with a little bit of trepidation, but mostly ambition, going to see how can we take accountability for that more than we have. So I think that would be the biggest reflection coming out of this, is that we can still play roles further on, even if our resources are limited.
Thanks, Carly. That's super interesting. And let me ask a quick follow-up question. I think the point is super clear, right? Like you have to think about what are the incentives, but you made the comparison to VCs. Now, I would argue most VCs operate in environments where the enabling environment is quite mature, right? So where the innovation ecosystem components are in place for something to go to scale, where a solution has the metaphorical line of sight. But you don't, not at least for a good number of your solutions, thinking of the Creating Hope in Conflict Grand Challenge, right, and others. So how do you go about being accountable for transitioning to scale and going further in environments where it's really risky, so to speak, to have that certainty because the enabling environment is quite weak or sometimes fast changing, right? So how do you square that with the accountability ambition?
Yeah, I mean, that's the crux of it, Ben. I would say we're not going to start with creating hope in conflict and kind of in the conflict setting, because some of the structures that lend to longer term sustainability are still, by definition, they're fragile. So where we're going to be focusing more is where we can identify there are already systems operating at scale. Think countries, think the global health initiatives like the Global Fund and Gavi, who are responsible for actually having certain vertical approaches adopted across scale. They signal that they're interested in innovation. They signal that they have big ambitions. And yet the process with which they actually take innovations on is ad hoc and chaotic at best. And so they're starting to have an awareness of how they need to do better at this. And we're seeing more receptivity to the kinds of conversations we're having with them. The Gavi scale-up facility is something that's been announced in June and then again in January. That's an example of where they're not trying to actually do it themselves, but they're trying to actually put together pieces of the puzzle in the ecosystem that can actually lead to scale and kind of get onto the Gavi platform that then has a nice smooth path towards countries. So this is the kind of thing that we have to set up, and our accountability is really around identifying who at scale is already there and how can we actually be incentivizing them and influencing them to operate in a way that will pull innovations to scale.
Thanks for unpacking that accountability point and the references. Super interesting. And what you just mentioned mirrors an observation we have made here at the OECD among the membership of the Development Assistance Committee. So 32 global North funder countries plus the EU. And something that Johannes also mentioned, which is an increasing focus on scaling within the innovation functions, but also beyond. And I really see quite a momentum on enhancing scaling practices from different angles, be it setting up a scale-up facility like Gavi and other initiatives among those bilaterals, but also among non-bilaterals, including foundations. So that's my cue now to ask Natalia to come to the stage. And it's a big pleasure having you here. Thanks for joining, Natalia. You know, just like Carly, you have a super important role in your organization, and you have done a really exceptional job as a foundation and as an individual of driving strategic scaling, but then still thought, I want to learn more. I want to better understand what we can improve. And just like Grand Challenges Canada, engaged in the mainstreaming initiative. And it's really good to see a funder organization that is based in the Global South engaged in this exercise, because the vast majority of case studies comes from the Global North. I found it super interesting reading the case study, and I hope that lots of colleagues in the audience will also go on the website and have a deeper look. But before doing so, as most haven't seen it yet, I'd love to hear from you, Natalia, similar to the question to Carly. What were some of the main insights, and was there maybe one or two that surprised you and that you would love to share with the audience, who we can assume, you know, works in fund organization, implementers, and probably a few think tanks? So some of the main insights and ideally something that surprised you. Thanks for being here, Natalia.
Thank you so much, Ben, for having us. Like Carly mentioned, it also came in a wonderful timing for us. Fundación Corona is a family foundation that has over 63 years of experience working in Colombia. And in the past 10 years, we had been working to advance in social mobility for the country. And we were working in education to employment and in citizen engagement to do so. We had developed some main models that were conceptual tools that we were working with and diversifying across the portfolio of the foundation. But in 2014, the foundation was going through this deep reflection process with the family, with allies, with different stakeholders from society. And we were considering and reflecting especially on how to be more bold on declaring a system approach in the strategic intent of the foundation. And learning from the context and different processes that we were taking stock also of where we were at that moment of reflection, we understood that the foundation had to shift to declare that we were going to be working on youth for the following years. And we hope to continue that until 2030 initially, but we know that these processes take a long approach and time. So we were discussing these systemic conversations and understanding how to make this more open to others so that people could understand what we were talking about. So for me, one of the exercises, having these conversations going back and forth with Larry and putting into words what we were trying to do was so important for the foundation. Coming to this concept of transformational scale, I think was very relevant because when you're talking about systemic transformation and you're talking about public policy and understanding shift and narrative change and behaviors, it's like if you're, for some people, it might be seen as you're overlooking for the reach in the metrics. But actually, what we were trying to acknowledge in this perspective is we were so aware of the magnitude of the challenges that we want to address that it didn't seem enough to be working on project basis to continue the path of the foundation. So I think one of the most useful things in here is picking our brains. Having to put down the case study was also an opportunity for us to reflect on all of the examples that we had, on all of the signals of different processes that we had been working on in education to employment, in participation, in working with youth to transform and build local public policies, as well as understanding the role of the foundation in different moments as a catalytic intermediary and not a market player. So the conversation was so wonderful because it allowed us to understand that we had more to say, but that we needed to improve the storytelling behind all of those efforts, and also to acknowledge more of the length that these kind of processes take. And we have embedding in our conversations like more efforts from the foundation to invest in practices and capacities that allow us to fulfill the roles that we want to take and to advance within the country more thoroughly. And I was pleased to read in the chat, like all the conversations around MEL practices and how to take that forward, because we do acknowledge that if we don't change the way that we see success, the way that we understand it as an organization, but also to the board, to the family, to society, to be accountable for what we're working on, it's going to be very hard to acknowledge signals and also to understand if we're moving forward or not. And during this year, by the end of 2025, we engaged in a process that we wished it had been more participatory than we were able to do it back then, but we intend for this practice to be more broad within Fundación Corona and our allies. We had this reflecting exercise based on outcome harvesting methodology. We didn't do it thoroughly also. It was a very agile exercise, but it did allow us to understand that we couldn't acknowledge results and successes just for 2025. Like the time frame it's not just to the effort, and it's not just to the realities of the transformations that we want, where we want to be. So we could acknowledge in those conversations that we had efforts that came like from a long track behind, and efforts that were even early stages in our past strategic intent, and that we were seeing strong signals of shifts in the transformation, but we were talking about a process. And we know that the moment that we ended in 2025 was just like the baseline for 2026 to take over, and 2027 and 2030 to dream of the process. So these reflections in putting the case study did push also some of the internal conversations that this is something that we need to keep talking about as a foundation, as a society, and also sharing these practices with different stakeholders in these kind of communities of practice with international actors also, because it allows us to understand better where are the call to actions. We need to be more aware of the patience that this takes. That is something that you highlighted in the presentation, and how sustained leadership has to be there to become believers in these kinds of practice, to make very intentional trade-off of what you want to privilege in your interventions, where you want to focus your results. And especially because it's necessary to understand that this is a long-term commitment.
Thanks so much. It really is right. I mean, the evidence base, as far as we've discovered solid studies on the duration of scaling pathways, is quite scarce. There's some good studies from digital agriculture and digital health, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa, that point to 10 to 15 years until solutions really unfold impact at sustainable scale. But yeah, it's a long-term engagement. I think that's an important message for so many of us who often face senior management expectations that might not be quite realistic to have like significant scale within a 2 to 3 year time frame. What you said about you as a foundation really looking at the system with the specific approach of outcome harvesting, which we won't unpack now what it is, but if there are colleagues in the audience who are a bit unsure, I really recommend looking up. Essentially, that structured approach to better identify whether a system and its component changed over time and produces different outcomes, I think is so important. That's a really crucial point that we raised in this guidance from the Development Assistance Committee, if I may be a bit self-promotional, that Johannes mentioned, that funders need to invest in strengthening the enabling environment. And for a lot of the bilateral funders, that becomes more and more difficult to make that case because there's more scrutiny on official development assistance, and there's higher pressure to not only work in the national interest, but also to deliver easy to quantify outputs. And that makes investments in systems so hard. And that's why I think it's amazing that you as a foundation focus also on this. This is where kind of the orchestra of different funders should come together and think of how can we provide additionality and invest in different components to enable scaling, not only along stages, but also the enabling environment. And while I have a follow-up question, I'm reminded about the halfway time of this panel being over. So Natalia, I'm just going to go on to our next panelist with a huge thanks, but I hope I can circle back to you. Jeff, I would love to invite you to the stage, and it's a huge pleasure having you here. Like Natalia, you work in the philanthropic sector, but you work with a wide range of foundations and philanthropies. And as far as I can see, highly influential and really knowledgeable too. You know, what's brewing, what are current practices. And what I'd be really curious to hear, when you listen to the findings of this mainstream study, do you think most of those recommendations are well known among a large part of your clients, among a large part of those philanthropies? Or do you think, there's actually quite some surprises there for them potentially, and it would be really good for them to understand it? So I'm really curious about, if you think a lot of the things are known, why hasn't the sector changed, right? If that stuff is kind of like clearly evident, why are we not moving in the right direction? If some of the things are new, what do you think can and should be done as next steps to infuse that kind of insight into the foundations and potentially inspire a change of practice?
Well, first, it's great to be here and really appreciate the research and the work here. It is impressive, and I think just speaks to some of the most important issues we face in making change in the world. And your question, Ben, is like at the heart of it, because I think partially there's a mix of things that are new, but I guess I'm more struck by the number of things where they reflect kind of a knowing-doing gap in philanthropy and private philanthropy and in foundations, where people will say one thing and then behave in a transactional way. If we keep it focused here, I think Natalia's presentation and the work at Fundación Corona, I think is somewhat exceptional. I mean, it's a wonderful model, extraordinary what they've done, but I don't see that many funders yet behaving in that way. And part of that is just the history of philanthropy and the way individual philanthropists think about their work and think about kind of what they hold themselves accountable for, and wanting to kind of demonstrate to themselves and to the world that they personally and their institution has had this profound impact. And so much of the scaling work in this research suggests that you're a piece of a bigger puzzle. And, at the beginning, like one of the things I think does stand out is while people in private philanthropy talk about, we need to integrate the thinking about scaling at the beginning, it's usually very internally oriented. I think the set of observations about the enabling conditions, about the external context and, government actors and how they behave. This varies by country, but for sure, the number of interventions that are created that have no chance of scaling through government systems because of their cost, for example, is one that's just a fascinating repetition that we see in private philanthropy, where we have kind of better mousetraps, but they're not actually scalable in the way that the report talks about transformational scale. So I think this question of integrating scale from the beginning is important, and the comments about MEL also, I think, are very important, because again, I think a lot of private philanthropists, while they have the flexibility and the ability to be incredible systems change catalysts, a lot of them are trapped in the old transactional paradigm of how they think about their own impact in the world. And they think about timelines that are shorter than is required to actually get work done here. So the Agenda Giving case, I also recommend, because one, it has an arc of a story that covers about 25 years or 20 years. And it's just a reminder that philanthropy, particularly when we talk about how much money there is in philanthropy now, if you take the folks that are sophisticated now, they've been doing it for a while. My experience is most philanthropists start on the transactional end, do that for a while, and then go, whoa, I'm not getting actually the outcomes I want. I need to begin thinking differently. So one question is, how do you shorten that learning process? And why does everybody have to go through it? And kind of we lose a decade. I mean, I often joke that in philanthropy, you often have this 10-year mark where the philanthropist pulls up and says, wait a minute, have I had any impact? Because there's this dawning realization that the counting number of people is different than actually changing the system in an enduring way. And so you have this learning journey of philanthropists going on that is a really important thing for people to figure out, is there a way to shorten it? And can private funders see their role as this kind of intermediary glue, helping with handoffs, facilitating intermediary structures with the kind of flexible capital they have, that's kind of enables these bigger pools of capital to be deployed against scale more powerfully. So I think that's it's this blend of old and new that's here, but also this learning journey that philanthropists go through that takes them from hearing something about systems change. I mean, I often joke there's no word now that's more common in the philanthropic lexicon than the word systems change. If you're writing a proposal to a nonprofit, you better say this systems change in the first paragraph, or you're gonna, no matter what you're doing, you just assert that you're we're a systems change agent. So it's people know it's important, but living into it, I think we still have a long distance to go.
Thanks, Jeff. That's super clear. And the way you laid it just out to me is honestly a really good framing for part of the mainstreaming campaign that Larry, Johannes, Gabi, and the colleagues from the global community, we collectively, are pushing forward with the specific target audience of philanthropy. So to me, this was highly valuable. And obviously, I don't come with clear answers, some initial ideas, probably with an OECD bias, peer learning and friendly competition. But this is something to be elaborated another time. But I do think that's the main purpose also of the scaling campaign, and super relevant. If I may, this is from previous work at the OECD and with others, and might or might not be so relevant. But I think it's really important for the sector to acknowledge we always intervene in systems, right? There's no such thing as a single point solution that's somewhat in a vacuum. And I think a better question is, What systems or system predominantly are we intervening? How is it currently functioning? What are its paradigms? And are we seeking to strengthen it? Which sometimes is the right thing to do, right? Like a national health system might have really solid paradigms and it needs to be strengthened. Or are we seeking, together with local change makers, to change it, to transform it? Because I think that requires a little bit of different interventions and a different mindset and also a different anchoring in local change makers. So I have a certain pet peeve with everything being systems change, because I think a lot of our work should be system strengthening. And that's just potentially a conceptual difference, but I do think it makes for different conversations and then different practice in funder organizations from the North. So thanks so much for that, Jeff. Really appreciated this, and we'll also circle back to you if time permits. And colleagues in the audience, again, your invitation to send questions in the chat. Homi, may I ask you to come on stage? Thank you so much for being with us. Likewise, an exceptional change maker in the sector with really impressive track record in the World Bank and then pushing the scaling agenda and strategic development cooperation writ large in Brookings. And my question builds up to how I framed it to Jeff, but with a different target audience in mind, predominantly multilateral development banks and other official funders, including bilaterals. Homi, if you look at the main recommendations coming out of the study that Johannes presented today, how much do you think is kind of known, but somehow the sector is just not moving? Then the question is why, and what can we do about it? And might there be things where you think, that's probably genuinely new, and we have to fill an information gap and really work on making those findings as grounded and salient as possible to all of them? So yeah, really curious to hear your reflections about multilateral development banks and bilaterals, climate funders. Why has the sector not moved? Many of the things are quite well known. What's new that we found out recently and we really have to push as a message?
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for having me. I mean, this is just such a rich body of work. But let me start with the one thing that really struck me, and that's the difference that is documented between transactional scaling and transformational scaling. I think this is something that is really important. And as Johannes said in his introduction, what the big MDBs have typically done is focused on transactional scaling rather than transformational scaling. And understanding that distinction, I think, is super important. So let me start by saying that, it's not that we need to shift everything. It's not that now everything should be transformational scaling and before it wasn't, etc. I think we have to understand that there are some things where we want transformational scaling and some things where actually transactional scaling is still the way to go. And so one question I have is whether we have a really good methodology for understanding when we really need transformational scaling with all the complexities that brings. And along with complexities, there are obviously risks. And when do we just continue with our transactional scaling? So there are two things why I think transformational scaling is really top of mind in so many people today. And that's because there's this sense that the world is fundamentally changing in two important dimensions. One is sustainability and everything associated with climate action, but also nature preservation, etc. The whole understanding that the way in which we go about much of our development processes needs to really change. And the second thing is digitization. Sometimes now, linked with AI, and the sense that that kind of technology is really going to change development as we saw it. And much of this actually has been laid out by Nick Stern in a fantastic new book called the Growth Agenda for the 21st Century, where he documents in real detail where the new innovations and the new technologies actually require what I would call transformational scaling. The reason why I'm emphasizing that is because when I think back, certainly at the World Bank, the examples that I would have given for transformational scaling, it typically took place at quite a local level. So the World Bank had these projects, that community-driven development projects, and a couple of really big ones. One in Indonesia, the Kecamatan Development Program, one in Brazil, which was a program of support to combat rural poverty, which was really support to small-scale rural producers. All of those, if you look at the evaluation reports, and this is where some of the comments on meal comes in, they basically said, if you go anywhere where these projects were affected, you could see real change. And I think that's, in some sense, encapsulates what we mean by transformational change. And it wasn't always predictable change. It wasn't always planned change. It was change that came from the communities themselves, who, understand much more what is the kind of change that needs to be facilitated. For a multilateral development bank that wants everything to be predictable, that kind of delegation of accountability and authority is very uncomfortable. And it remains the case today. And it's why we don't have so much transformational change. I would say one of the great examples today, the World Bank and the African Development Bank have this program called M300 to reach 300 million people without electricity in Africa. I would call that largely transactional scaling, because all they are doing is saying, we need to link up these people with, provide them with electricity. They're not asking the broader question of how will that electricity change their lives? And for many rural producers, the amount of electricity they're getting won't be enough to run agricultural machinery and things like that. So it's an example of where the idea of what is the change in society that we want to bring about hasn't yet aligned with the kind of the practice and the metrics that are used in these transactional models. If you want to really go to thinking about a change in society, you need really a long-term engagement. And Johannes said alignment with mid-management and staff. I just want to reflect and remind people that in the two examples that I gave in Indonesia and in Brazil, the staff members leading those programs stayed with those programs for 10 to 15 years. They were never rewarded in the institution. They knew that they would never be rewarded in the institution, and they did it despite that because of their commitment to what they were actually doing. But from a pure hierarchical point of view, they never got that kind of reward, and we still haven't brought that into these institutions, that this is really something to reward and to celebrate, rather than forcing people to try to make those kinds of transactions. Thank you.
Omi, thank you so much for that overview. And then in the end, zooming in again on something really important, but somewhat, in my perception at least, under-discussed when we talk about scaling and institutional arrangements, the human component and the unwritten incentives that are very often linked to starting something new, right? That is associated with a notion of leadership, as opposed to taking pride in continuing important work and iterating it and driving it to scale and really celebrating dexterity and grinding over all these years that are required. So I think that point that you just made about the staff members staying on for so long is really important. We know that in many organizations, the staff turnover rates are much higher. So we have to think, if you're in a leadership position, no matter what level, what can you do to change those informal norms around celebrating to always starting something new? and celebrating what I just outlined. So yeah, thanks so much for that. Before handing over to Larry, I just want to conclude by saying this pointer digitization is so important, and it links back to a point that Jeff raised, right, about realistic per unit costs. If you want to scale, this has to be affordable if it's a public sector scaling pathway, or profitable if we are talking about a social enterprise with relevant impact. And obviously we can reach more people and reduce costs with digital offerings. But this is where, and this is going to hand over to Larry now, this notion of optimal scale comes in that really asks questions about inequalities and inequities, and where we have to continue pushing the button of we have to think about reaching marginalized communities and scaling not as an industrial, the more the merrier concept, but really also you could frame it as scaling deep to reach last mile communities. And with that, I'm going to hand back to you, Larry, and say thanks.
Thanks goes in the other direction, Ben. I want to thank you for a really skillful facilitation of a super interesting conversation. If I knew how to do that emoji where the confetti goes up, I would throw it up right now, because on a subject about which I thought I knew a lot, I took maybe 10 pages of notes in that conversation. It was a terrific, terrific, terrific conversation, and thanks to all of you who participated in it. No less interesting was what was going on in the chat simultaneously. And my colleagues and I are going to look at that afterwards and see if there isn't something more we can do in writing than the responses that Richard and others have been providing along the way. Again, super, super conversation. I was given the luxury of saying a couple of things at the end, and I'm going to, but with a little bit of trepidation, because I don't want to repeat what I thought were really wonderful and very well made points along the way. Let me pick up on something that Homie alluded to a little bit, but mostly was not talked about, which is the moment of time that we're in right now, which seems to me the best of times and the worst of times. Probably most obviously the worst of times in all the things that are collapsing around us. The best of times only in one sense, in that around all this collapse comes a certain receptivity to consider alternatives that I think people would have found excuses not to look at otherwise. And so as a community, I challenge all of us, and this will be our conversation tomorrow, to think about how to take advantage of the particular time that we're in, to get people to take into account things that in some cases we've known for a long time but haven't acted on. In some cases, as Ben implied, some things that are genuinely new learnings along the way. For example, this issue that Jeff raised about the knowing-doing gap. This is infuriating for all of us, probably everyone on this call, who over time has seen some of these things so desperately in need of change and so difficult to move. And what we were trying to do in the case studies was to highlight not just the need to move these things, but how some organizations are doing or have done that. So those of you who are in the middle of this or just want to know more about it, I hope you'll go all the way back to the source material in the case studies themselves, because they give you, to the best we could document it, what organizations are actually doing to try and deal with these realities. I'll give you just a couple of points that I think are significant, but I could equally give you 50. One of the ones that seems to me very important and increasingly obvious is that there are only a couple of systems that can deliver outcomes sustainably at scale. And those are basically host country governments and private sector players, with some notable exceptions, but those are the dominant ones. So when we have projects that willfully choose to separate themselves from those things in order to give themselves more independence and more latitude of motion, we set up a dynamic that makes it incredibly difficult to find your way back to what Kevin Starr calls the doers and the payers at scale. So who has an incentive and an ability to pay for the delivery at scale? Who has an incentive and an ability to actually deliver at scale? And it's a relatively limited number of players. And we're beginning to understand more and more, I think, how the limited interventions that we have the luxury of performing can, at least potentially in the best case, inform, strengthen, or in some cases, influence those sorts of processes. Another thing that came out very strongly, I think largely, Ben, thanks to your intermediation on this, is the intermediation function. And the fact that in many cases, we have the innovation function moving quite nicely, and even the delivery function, but the two don't connect. And whereas that's a relatively mature process in the private sector, or at least in certain parts of the private sector, it doesn't tend to be very mature in the worlds where we live. So how can we as third-party actors begin to find those linkages where they are, but also help to build them and the institutions that can help with that along the way, and see that not as incidental to our role, but perhaps central to our role. Finally, I think there was a really important distinction, not made quite explicitly, but it was right between the lines all the way, between trying to scale your intervention. You're an intervener, either an innovator or a funder. You have something that you're keen to see scaled, and how different that is than simply trying to seek a permanent solution to a problem. And that when you begin with the embrace of the problem before you go around selling the solution, it changes the dynamic entirely. All of a sudden, the question is, who has the ability to solve it? What would it take to solve it? What role can we play? And less, how do we get people to join my parade? These, to me, are easy to say, hard to do. You're going to hear from this community of practice beginning tomorrow the concept of a campaign. What's a campaign? Well, it's trying to do whatever we can, whatever anyone can, to change the practices of as many players in this arena as possible, to be more reflective of what it really takes to make lasting change at scale. And for that, we think we have some hints, we have some starting points, but we really, really need your input. So beginning tomorrow, the conversation is very much more a conversation around where we go from here, how we take this thing forward through time, and what it would look like to both resource and implement a program that was truly transformational in that larger sense of transformational. I'll end by inviting Johannes to come back on if he'd like to say any final words, but my final words are a huge thank you to all of you, beginning with the panelists and the moderators, to my colleague Johannes and Richard for trying to get us as far as we are, and a challenge to all of us to try and keep it moving forward from here. Johannes?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just the 2 points. I think the point that Jeff made on intermediation, I think, this is where foundations maybe have a bigger role than they have seen so far. And I think that's partly what Jeff was trying to say, that they really not focus only on sort of impact on the ground, which of course is critical, but also on what can they do to magnify and amplify and catalyze that impact by serving as intermediaries, because they have the flexibility. They can take the risks to do so, which the larger bilateral, politically driven organizations, accountable taxpayer for every dollar that's being spent that has to demonstrate impact as a tax dollar is much more difficult. And finally, yeah, I just want to come back to the incentive issue that Homi so dramatically demonstrated with his example at the end, because to me that I now realize is really at the core. And I just want to give you a small example. So Richard Cole, my colleague, who has never been working in one of the big organizations, in contrast to myself, asked me one day, Johannes, why is it that all these senior people who worked for years inside these organizations, these big funder organizations, while they were there, did all this transactional stuff and, worked like crazy to make it transactionally working. When they step outside, all of a sudden they realize that that's not good enough. And they all turn and come to us, and you did. Now, when you're outside the bank, the World Bank, and you say, hey, we need to focus on scaling, we need to focus on transformational scaling and so on. Why is it? They're the same people. Well, it's because of the incentives. When I was inside as a vice president for Europe and Central Asia, I was driven, and I look back and I'm not proud of it. I was driven by the incentives of the day, which among other things meant that I told my colleagues, don't co-finance with other funders because it takes extra time, it takes extra resources, creates risks, and we can't afford that because we are accountable for delivering a project on time with the results, and we don't have the resources to actually reach out to other funders and work with them and all this. I was part of the problem because I was working in an incentive system that stressed not the longer term transformational goals that we all recognize are important, but I was reacting to the incentives that made it important and essential that I deliver on the project model. So I'm guilty as much as everybody else, and I'm very proud of the colleagues who didn't, as Homie pointed out, but who stuck it out for 10 or 15 years. And I have examples in many other funder organizations that very similar, where individual staff stick to their guns and manage to actually have success in terms of scaling, but they're not rewarded, not encouraged, and not supported by the organizations. Well, sorry about that last emotional outburst here, but thank you all for joining us today. It was really a terrific session, and thanks to our panel. And again, thanks to our funder partners, because without them, we could not have done that.
Come back tomorrow.
Yes, please.
Same time, same place.
We need you. You're part of our campaign now, so we need you. Take care, everybody.
See you then. Bye-bye, everyone.